The hum of chatter and clinking dishes filled O'Charlie's restaurant in Lebanon, Tennessee, as the dinner rush peaked. The scent of sizzling steaks and warm bread rolls wafted through the air, mingling with the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby table. It was another long shift for Nate Afortit, an 18-year-old high school senior balancing school and work. For the past year, Nate had worked 5 days a week at the restaurant, hoping to save up for his first car. It wasn't easy. He often came home exhausted, only to wake up early for school the next morning. But he wasn't one to complain. His parents had taught him that hard work built character, and besides, he liked the job. The fast pace, the variety of customers, and even the occasional kitchen chaos kept things interesting. Tonight, however, something felt different. As Nate weaved between tables, balancing a tray of drinks in one hand, he caught sight of a young family settling into a booth near the window. The woman, Lola, looked tired, but happy. Her husband chatting with their daughter, who giggled as she played with a crayon on the kids' menu. They seemed like a close-knit family, the kind that reminded Nate of his own. He greeted them with a friendly smile, jotting down their orders with practiced ease. "I'll be right back with your drinks," he said, before hurrying off to the kitchen. The evening went on as usual, orders coming in, dishes going out. Nate barely had a moment to breathe, but he didn't mind. The tips had been decent tonight, and if he kept it up, he'd be one step closer to affording that used car he had been eyeing. But as the night wound down and the last customers trickled out, Nate noticed something unusual at the family's table. Something small, something that didn't belong. An envelope, partially hidden beneath a napkin, just sitting there. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around. The family was gone. The table had already been cleared, except for that one out-of-place envelope. Nate reached for it, flipping it over in his hands. It was heavier than expected. His stomach tensed. He slowly opened the flap and peeked inside, only to have his breath catch in his throat. Cash. Stacks of it. A slow chill crept up his spine as his mind raced. What should he do? Who had left this? Was this a mistake? Or was it meant for someone? He looked around the restaurant. And that's when the real night began. Nate's hands tightened around the envelope as he took a steadying breath. The weight of the cash inside wasn't just physical. It pressed against his conscience like an unspoken question. How much money was in here? Hundreds? Thousands? He didn't dare count. His heart pounded as he glanced around the dimly lit restaurant. Most of the customers were gone, leaving only a few stragglers finishing up their meals. The soft hum of distant conversations mixed with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen. No one had seen him pick up the envelope. He could feel the temptation whispering in the back of his mind. This could be your chance. He had been saving for months, working long hours while his friends hung out after school. He had walked to shifts in the rain, borrowed rides from co-workers, and even skipped social events just to put a few extra dollars away for a car. And now, right in his hands, was enough money to change everything. His fingers brushed the edges of the envelope, his throat dry. But then another thought broke through. What if this belonged to someone who needed it just as much as he did? His stomach twisted as he looked back at the table where the family had been sitting. The little girl had been coloring, the mother laughing softly with her husband. What if this was their rent money? Their savings? He swallowed hard. This wasn't his money. With a deep breath, Nate turned and made his way toward the kitchen, where the restaurant manager Rick was going over receipts at the counter. "Hey, Rick," Nate said, his voice steady but firm. Rick looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Nate hesitated for just a second before placing the envelope on the counter. "I found this at table 7. I think a customer left it behind." Rick frowned, wiping his hands on his apron before picking up the envelope. He gave it a slight shake, feeling the weight. and then opened it just enough to see inside. His eyes widened. "Whoa," he muttered, looking up at Nate. "This is a lot?" "I know," Nate said, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I think it belonged to the last family that sat there. A couple with a little girl. The mom's name was Lola. I caught it on the receipt." Rick gave a low whistle, then nodded. "All right. We'll hold on to it and see if they call." Nate let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He had done the right thing. The right thing was supposed to feel good. So why did he still feel like something big was about to happen? At that moment, the restaurant phone rang. Rick picked it up, and Nate stood there, waiting, his heart hammering against his ribs. A few seconds later, Rick's expression changed. His eyes flicked toward Nate. "It's her." Rick's voice was steady as he answered the call, but Nate could hear the urgency on the other end. He watched as his manager's brows furrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Yes, ma'am," Rick said, glancing at the envelope in his hand. "We did find something. Can you describe it?" Nate held his breath. A muffled voice crackled through the phone. The woman, Lola, speaking rapidly. Though Nate couldn't hear the words, he could feel the desperation in her tone. Rick nodded along, flipping the envelope over in his hands. "All right. Yeah, that sounds about right." He exhaled and gave Nate a quick glance before turning back to the phone. "You're lucky, ma'am. One of our servers found it and turned it in." For a second, there was silence. Then a sharp, audible breath came through the receiver. "Oh my God," the woman gasped. "Are you serious?" Rick smirked, nodding again. "Serious as can be. Your envelope is safe. You can come back and pick it up." The voice on the other end broke, not in frustration, but in relief. Nate heard what sounded like a choked sob. Then, "You have no idea what this means to us," Lola whispered, her voice shaking. "I thought we lost everything." Nate's stomach clenched. "Everything?" Rick, now fully invested in the conversation, leaned on the counter. "It must have been real important money, huh?" Another pause. Then Lola spoke again, quieter this time. "That was our rent. We were on our way to drop it off tonight. If we didn't have it by tomorrow morning, we would have lost our home." Nate felt his chest tighten. He had imagined it might be something important, but not this important. He glanced at the envelope sitting between Rick's fingers. That single, forgotten envelope had been the only thing standing between a family and losing their home. Rick cleared his throat. "Well, good thing it landed in the right hands." He flicked his eyes toward Nate. "Come on by. We'll be here." The woman thanked him over and over before hanging up. Rick placed the phone down and turned to Nate, shaking his head with a grin. "Kid, you just saved a family from being homeless." Nate felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. "Yeah," he said quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I guess so." Rick gave him a clap on the back. "She'll be here soon. You should be the one to give it back to her." Nate blinked. "Me?" "Yeah, why not? You're the one who found it. Might as well get the credit." Nate hesitated. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. But deep down, he was curious to meet the woman whose life had almost changed forever. All because of one forgotten envelope. As the minutes passed, he could feel his heart beating faster. Then, the door swung open. And there she was. The restaurant door swung open with a chime, and Lola stepped inside, her face flushed with anxiety. Her husband was right behind her, carrying their sleepy daughter in his arms. Nate stood behind the counter, watching as her frantic eyes darted around the room until they locked onto Rick. She rushed forward. "You have it?" she asked breathlessly. Rick didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Nate and gave a small nod. Lola followed his gaze, her eyes landing on the young server. For the first time, she seemed to really see him, not just as a waiter from earlier that evening, but as someone who had made a life-changing decision in the span of a few seconds. Nate stepped forward, the envelope in his hands. "Yeah," he said, holding it out to her. "I think this belongs to you." Lola's hands trembled as she took the envelope, clutching it to her chest like it was something sacred. For a brief second, she just stood there, blinking down at it, as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then, to Nate's surprise, she let out a sharp, shuddering breath, and tears began spilling down her cheeks. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Oh my God, I can't believe this." Her husband placed a steadying hand on her back, his own face tight with emotion. He gave Nate a nod, swallowing hard. "You have no idea what this means to us," he said, his voice rough with gratitude. Nate shifted awkwardly, not sure what to say. I'm just glad you got it back," he mumbled. Lola shook her head fiercely. "Number you don't understand." She wiped at her eyes and took a deep breath. "We're not just talking about losing money. If we didn't have this, we would have been out of our apartment by tomorrow." Her voice wavered. "We have a 5-year-old. We have nowhere else to go." Nate felt something tighten in his chest. He had almost kept that money. He had stood there, looking at it, thinking about how much it could change his life. But now, he realized something terrifying. If he had made the wrong choice, if he had even hesitated for a little longer, this woman, this family, would have been out on the street tonight. His throat went dry. He had never been more grateful for his decision. Lola reached out suddenly, grabbing his hands. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaking. "You don't know how rare people like you are. You could have kept it, but you didn't." Nate felt heat creep up his neck. I just did what anyone would have done." She let out a small, watery laugh. "No," she said. "You did what a good person would do." Her daughter stirred in her father's arms, rubbing her tired eyes. She looked at Nate sleepily before whispering, "Mommy's happy now." Lola's breath hitched. She crouched down, pulling her daughter into a tight hug, the envelope still clutched in her hand. Rick, standing behind them, gave Nate a slow nod of approval. "You did good, kid." Nate swallowed hard, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. He had been saving for months, working himself to exhaustion for his own goals. But tonight, he had done something worth far more than a car. And somehow, it felt like he had gained something much greater. The next morning, Nate woke up feeling different. Lighter, maybe. He had always believed in doing the right thing. But something about last night had stuck with him. Maybe it was the way Lola had looked at him, like he was the last bit of hope she had left. Or maybe it was the little girl's sleepy whisper, "Mommy's happy now." Whatever it was, he couldn't shake it. By the time he got to school, the night before already felt like a memory. But then, during lunch, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Rick. "Check Facebook, kid. You're famous." Nate frowned. Famous? He quickly opened the app, and the first thing he saw was his name. Everywhere. Lola had written a post. A long one. "Last night, something incredible happened. My husband, daughter, and I went to O'Charlie's for dinner. In the chaos of getting our little one ready to leave, we accidentally left behind an envelope that held every dollar we had to pay our rent. I was devastated when I realized it was gone. I called the restaurant, barely able to speak, expecting the worst. But instead, I got a miracle. An 18-year-old server named Nate Afortit found it. And instead of keeping it, despite how easy it would have been, he turned it in. Because of him, we still have our home today. If you ever doubt the goodness in this world, remember Nate. Young people like him give me hope. He didn't just return money, he gave us a second chance. Let's show him that honesty still matters. Nate stared at the screen, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. The post had thousands of shares already. And the comments. What an incredible young man. We need more people like Nate in this world. Can someone start a GoFundMe for this kid? He deserves it. I don't know Nate, but if he needs a ride, I have a used car sitting in my driveway. I'd be happy to sell him at a discount. Nate's jaw dropped. A GoFundMe? A car? What was happening? Before he could even process it, his phone buzzed again. This time a call from Rick. You seeing this? Rick said, his voice filled with amusement. Yeah, Nate stammered. This is crazy. Well, buckle up, kid, Rick said with a chuckle. News stations are already calling the restaurant. They want to interview you. Nate felt like the world had tilted sideways. Yesterday, he was just another teenager working at a restaurant, saving for a car. Today, the entire town knew his name. And it wasn't over yet. Because what happened next would change everything. By the time Nate finished his shift at O'Charlie's that night, the restaurant was buzzing, not with customers, but with excitement. Local news crews had parked outside, their cameras set up near the entrance. People had started calling the restaurant just to ask about him. And to his shock, some customers even stopped by just to shake his hand. You're a good kid, Nate, an older man told him, pressing a $50 bill into his palm before he could protest. Don't ever change. Nate was overwhelmed. He had never been one for attention, and now it felt like everyone in town knew who he was. Then, as his shift ended, Lola walked in again, this time with a different expression. Instead of panic, her face was lit with pure joy. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a man in a suit, holding a clipboard, and next to him, a younger guy with a camera slung over his shoulder. Are you Nate? The suited man asked, stepping forward. Nate swallowed. Yeah? The man smiled. I'm from WKRN News. We wanted to meet the kid who proved that honesty still matters. The next 30 minutes were a blur. He answered questions, trying not to sound awkward as the camera rolled. Lola shared her side of the story, explaining how close they had come to losing everything, until Nate's simple act of integrity saved them. By the time the interview wrapped up, Nate was ready to escape the attention. But before he could slip out, Lola stopped him. We wanted to do something for you, she said softly. I never expected this story to spread like it did, but people have been reaching out. They wanted to help. Nate tilted his head, confused. Help? She smiled. The GoFundMe. His stomach dropped. The GoFundMe. I didn't start it, she explained, but when people heard what you did, they wanted to give back. So, someone made a fundraiser in your name. Rick, standing nearby, gave Nate a clap on the back. You might want to sit down for this, kid. Lola turned her phone around so Nate could see the screen. He leaned in, and his breath caught in his throat. $12,417. $12,000. His legs nearly gave out. I don't... He shook his head, his brain struggling to catch up. This can't be real. Lola smiled, eyes shining. It is, and it's all yours. Nate was speechless. For months he had worked tirelessly, saving every spare dollar he could for a car. And now, because of one honest decision, he had more than enough. Not just for a car, but for school. For his future. The restaurant erupted into applause as reality sank in. People weren't just rewarding him for returning the money. They were investing in him. As he looked around at the faces, Lola's grateful smile, Rick's proud smirk, strangers clapping like they knew him, Nate felt something bigger than shock: purpose. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't just about what he had gained. It was about what he had proven. Honesty still mattered. And sometimes, doing the right thing didn't just change someone else's life, it changed your own.